Hello everyone, welcome to another video. Today we have a very special one, if I say so myself. And we are going to read and go through everything related to vampires. Let's start. The true origins of vampires, from ancient night demons to Dracula. Tonight, we are going to explore one of the oldest and darkest legends in human history, the vampire. A creature of the night, a being that feeds on blood, an immortal shadow that has haunted humanity for centuries. Many people believe that vampires began with the famous Count Dracula. But the truth is far older. Long before the Gothic castles, before the Victorian novels, before the word vampire even existed, ancient civilizations already feared something that walked in the darkness. Creatures that drained life itself. And tonight we are going to travel through time to discover where the legend of the vampire truly began. The first night demons. Thousands of years ago, in the last of ancient Mesopotamia, people believed that the darkness was not empty. When the sun disappeared and the world fell silent beneath the night sky, the hours of darkness were thought to belong to demons. The night was a realm where unseen forces moved freely, where spirits wandered through villages and deserts alike, and where humanity was most vulnerable. Among the most feared of these beings was Lamashtu, and we know her quite well. A terrifying female spirit described in ancient tablets and carvings. She was imagined with sharp claws and cruel teeth, a monstrous presence driven by an insatiable hunger for human blood. According to the stories preserved in clay tablets, Lamashtu slipped silently into homes under the cover of night, creeping through doorways and shadows to prey upon the most defenseless. Mothers and infants were believed to be her favored victims, and many feared that illnesses or sudden death in the night was the mark of her passing. She was said to drink blood and feed upon the very life of her victims, leaving only silence behind her. Alongside her were other spirits known as the Lilitu, shadowy, wandering beings who moved through the darkness like whispers carried on the wind. These night spirits were believed to approach sleeping humans, seducing or enchanting them in their dreams before slowly draining their life force. By the time dawn arrived, the Lilitu had vanished again into the shadows, leaving behind only unease and the lingering sense that something unseen has passed through the night. Though the people of Mesopotamia did not use the word vampire, the creatures they feared shared many of the same qualities that would later define that legend. They were beings of the night, immortal predators that thrive on darkness, feeding not only on blood but on the vital essence of human life itself. So I really like that chapter because obviously it connects what we were reading through the last few weeks and goes into the subject that we are discussing today. The next chapter is blood drinkers of ancient Greece. Centuries later, in the world of ancient Greece, stories began to emerge of creatures even darker and more haunting than the night demons of earlier civilizations. Greek mythology, rich with tales of gods, curses, and transformations, introduced figures whose legends would bring the idea of the vampire closer to the form we recognize today. Among these beings was the tragic figure of Lamia, another acquaintance of ours. According to myth, Lamia had once been a beautiful queen, admired by her grace and quiet presence. Yet her fate changed after she drew her jealousy and the wrath of the goddess Hera. As punishment, Hera cursed Lamia with unbearable grief, driving her slowly into madness. In her torment, Lamia transformed into something monstrous, no longer a queen, but a creature of the night. She was said to wander through the darkness in search of her victims, driven by a terrible hunger, preying upon children and drinking their blood. Over time, Lamia became a symbol of sorrow twisted into horror, a once human figure reshaped into a predator feared by those who told her story. Another being whispered about in Greek lore was the terrifying Imposa, a shape-shifting demon associated with the night. Unlike Lamia, Imposa was known for deception. Legend described her stalking lonely travelers along dark roads and remote paths, often appearing first as a beautiful woman in order to lure her victims closer. Only when it was too late would her true form be revealed, something monstrous and unnatural, a creature that fed on human blood. These chilling figures marked an important step into a long evolution of vampire mythology. Though the word itself had not yet been spoken, the elements were already there. Predators of the night, hunters of human blood, creatures whose existence blurred the boundary between myth, fear, and the darkness that has always fascinated the human imagination. The vampire panic of Europe. By the Middle Ages, something strange and deeply unsettling began to take hold across paths of Eastern Europe. In villages scattered through regions that are today Serbia, Romania, Hungary, and Bulgaria, people became increasingly convinced that the dead were not always staying in their graves. Stories spread of the recently deceased returning under the cover of darkness, leaving their burial places at night to wander among the living. These beings came to be known as vampires. According to the local belief, a vampire was often someone who had died only days or weeks before, perhaps a neighbor, a relative, or someone who had passed away unexpectedly. It was said that these restless dead rose from the earth after sunset to drink the blood of the living, feeding on family members or villagers while they slept. When unexplained illness spread through the community, or when several people died within a short period of time, suspicion quickly turned towards the graveyard. Villagers believed that the source of the sickness might not be disease, but one of the dead returning to prey upon the living. In response, graves were sometimes reopened so that the body could be inspected. Those who witnessed these exhumations often interpreted natural processes of decomposition as supernatural signs. Corpses that had not yet fully decayed, bodies that appeared swollen, or traces of blood around the mouth were all seen as proof that the deceased had been feeding at night. To the villagers, these signs seemed unmistakable. The dead had become vampires. Historical records show that such fears were not merely stories whispered by the candlelight. They occasionally resulted in real investigations. One of the most famous cases occurred in 1725 in a Serbian village of Kisiljevo, where villagers claimed that a recently buried man named Petar Blagojevic had returned from the grave to attack members of the community. Reports describe villagers opening his grave and claiming that his body appeared unusually preserved, with fresh blood visible at the mouth. Convinced that he had become a vampire, they drove a stake through his heart and burned the body. Another well-known incident followed a few years later with the case of Arnold Paole, a former soldier whose death was followed by a series of mysterious illnesses and deaths in his village. Authorities eventually exhumed his body as part of an official investigation, and the strange findings were recorded in documents that spread throughout Europe. To destroy a suspected vampire, villagers carried out rituals that would later become famous in folklore and literature. A wooden stake was driven through the heart of the corpse to pin it to the earth. In other cases, the body was decapitated, or the remains were burnt entirely to ensure the creature could never rise again. These practices, shocking as they may seem today, were born from genuine fear and desperation in communities struggling to understand sudden outbreaks of disease. By the 18th century, these beliefs had spread widely enough that reports of vampires reached scholars, officials, and newspapers across Europe. The phenomenon became known as the vampire panic, a wave of fear and fascination that captured the imagination of the continent. For many people living at that time, vampires were not distant legends or fictional monsters. They were a terrifying possibility, something that might be buried just beneath the soil of the village graveyard, waiting for night to fall once again. And before we go to our main character today, let's dive into a few rare vampire legends around the world. In Chinese folklore, there exists a strange and unsettling creature known as the jiangshi, often described in Western writing as a kind of hopping vampire. Unlike the elegant vampires of European legends, the jiangshi is not graceful, nor does it move silently through the night. Instead, it is said to be a stiff, reanimated corpse that travels in a peculiar and eerie way, by hopping forward with its arms stretched rigidly before it. Kind of reminds me of the zombies being depicted, with their arms stretched. According to traditional stories, the body of a jiangshi has become so rigid after death that it cannot bend its limbs, forcing it to move through the darkness in these unnatural jumps. Dressed in burial garments and pale from death, the creature wanders under the cover of night in search of the living. Yet, what makes the Jiangshi especially intriguing is that it does not feed on blood in the way European vampires do. Instead, it is believed to drain something far more mysterious, the vital force of its victims. In Chinese tradition, this energy is known as qi, the invisible essence believed to flow through all living beings and sustain both body and spirit. A jiangshi is said to approach sleeping or unsuspecting victims and slowly absorb this life energy, weakening them and leaving them ill, exhausted, or lifeless. Stories of the jiangshi became especially popular in Chinese folklore and literature, where they were often associated with improper burials, wandering spirits, or bodies that had not been laid to rest correctly. Though strange and even somewhat surreal in its movements, the jiangshi represents a fascinating parallel to the vampire legends of the West. A reminder that across different cultures and continents, humans have long imagined the possibility that the dead might rise again to feed upon the living. In Romanian folklore, one of the most feared and mysterious undead beings was the strigoi. For centuries, stories of the strigoi circulated through villages and rural communities across Romania and the broader region of Transylvania, where the boundary between the world of the living and the realm of the dead was often imagined to be fragile and easily crossed. The strigoi were believed to be restless souls, spirits of the dead, who could not find peace in the grave and therefore returned to wander among the living during the night. Unlike some other undead figures in European folklore, the strigoi were not always visible. Legends claim that they could move unseen through homes and villages, slipping through walls or drifting like shadows in the darkness. At other times, they were said to take on a physical form, appearing almost human, yet carrying an unsettling presence that marked them as something not quite alive. Some traditions suggested that the strigoi possessed even stranger abilities. Certain stories claim that they could transform into animals, such as wolves, dogs, or bats, moving silently through forests and fields before returning to the places where they had once lived. Others believe that the strigoi fed on the life force of their victims, draining vitality from sleeping family members or spreading illness among livestock and neighbors. In many villages, people feared that certain individuals were destined to become strigoi after death, perhaps because of unusual birth circumstances, strange behavior during life, or the belief that their soul had never fully separated from their body. Because of this fear, elaborate rituals were often carried out during burial to ensure the dead would remain at rest. Graves might be guarded, special prayers recited, or protective objects placed in coffins to prevent the deceased from rising again. These customs reveal how deeply the fear of the strigoi was woven into local belief, forming one of the most enduring and chilling traditions within the folklore of Eastern Europe. Actually, me being born in Ukraine, I have heard about strigoi. They are very similarly called as well. And yeah, we did have a few traditions circulating. I mean, obviously, not at the time that I was living there, and I was very young, so it's not like I was aware about all the nuances and stuff like that. But either way, I would definitely recommend checking one of the stories by Nikolai Gogol. I'm not quite sure how it's called in English, honestly, and even my brain, now thinking about it, is a bit confused of what kind of words could be included. But there is a story about a young girl. It's a story about the young girl who died, and then her kind of the boy who was in love with her goes to visit her, but all of a sudden she kind of awakes. It's a very creepy movie, honestly. It's a very creepy story. Of course, we are talking about Nikolai Gogol, so it can only be creepy, but I would recommend checking it. In the folklore of the Philippines, one of the most feared and unsettling creatures of the night is known as the aswang. For generations, stories of the aswang have been passed down through villages and communities, often told in hushed voices after the nightfall. Unlike many monsters that exist only in distant forests or abandoned places, the aswang is particularly frightening because it is believed to live quietly among ordinary people. During the day, it may appear completely human, an ordinary neighbor, a traveler, or a familiar face in the village. Nothing about its appearance reveals the darkness that it hides. But when night falls, the stories say the aswang reveals its true nature. It transforms into a monstrous predator that prowls through the darkness in search of victims. Legends describe the creature as a shapeshifter capable of taking many forms, sometimes appearing as a large bat-like being or other terrifying animals. In some tales, the aswang is said to drink blood, much like the vampires of European legends. In others, its appetite is even more disturbing, as it is believed to feed on human organs or prey upon the unborn, using long, thin tongues or supernatural abilities to reach its victims. Because of these stories, the aswang remains one of the most feared figures in Filipino folklore even today. For many people, it is more than just a myth. It is a powerful cultural symbol of the dangers that might lurk unseen in the darkness, reminding listeners that not every face in the daylight can be trusted once night arrives. And we finally arrive to the main character. But before, we are going to go to the man behind Dracula. Eventually, the long evolution of vampire legends became intertwined with the story of a real historical figure whose reputation was so terrifying that his name would echo through centuries of folklore and literature. That man was Vlad III, Dracula, a prince who ruled the region of Wallachia, located in what is now modern-day Romania, during the turbulent 15th century. Born around 1431, Vlad was the son of Vlad II, a member of a chivalric Order of the Dragon, a Christian military order created to defend Europe against the advancing Ottoman Empire. Because of his father's membership to this order, Vlad inherited the name Dracula, derived from the word Dracul, meaning dragon. In the Romanian language of the time, the name Dracula therefore meant son of the dragon, Vlad's life unfolded during a period of intense political instability and near constant warfare. Wallachia lay between powerful empires, caught between the expanding Ottomans to the south and the kingdoms of Hungary and other European powers to the north. In this dangerous landscape, rulers often survived only through ruthless displays of power. Vlad quickly became known for ruling with extreme severity, believing that fear was the most effective way to maintain order and protect his territory. His preferred method of punishment was impalement, a brutal execution in which victims were placed upon tall wooden stakes. This practice earned him the infamous title Vlad the Impaler. Historical accounts written by both enemies and travelers who passed through his lands describe horrifying scenes in which the bodies of criminals, traitors, and captured enemies were displayed outside cities and along major roads. Some reports even spoke of vast forests of stakes surrounding his strongholds, where hundreds and even thousands of impaled bodies were left as a warning to anyone who might challenge his authority. Although many of these stories were exaggerated or shaped by political propaganda, they spread rapidly across Europe through pamphlets and chronicles, turning Vlad into one of the most feared rulers of his time. Effective. His name became associated with cruelty, darkness, and a chilling sense of justice that seemed almost supernatural in its severity. Some of this justice could be applied to the current men in power. Centuries later, these grim tales would capture the imaginations of writers searching for inspiration. When the Irish author Bram Stoker began writing his famous Gothic novel Dracula in the 19th century, he discovered the historical figure of Vlad Dracula and borrowed his name for the fictional vampire count. Yet, despite this powerful connection, the real Vlad III was not a vampire. He was a man, one shaped by the brutal realities of medieval warfare and politics, whose terrifying reputation grew so large that it eventually merged with an ancient myth of blood-drinking creatures that had haunted human imaginations for centuries. The birth of the modern vampire. In 1897, centuries of scattered legends, fears, and folklore were gathered and transformed by a single writer into one unforgettable figure. That writer was Bram Stoker, an Irish novelist who worked for many years as the manager of the famous Lyceum Theatre of London. Though Stoker had never visited Eastern Europe himself, he became fascinated by the strange stories and superstitions of the region. While researching for a new Gothic story, he studied travel accounts, local folklore, and historical references to mysterious creatures said to wander at night. During this process, he came across the name of the Wallachian ruler Vlad III Dracula, whose reputation for cruelty and darkness left a strong impression on him. The name Dracula, unusual and haunting, seemed perfectly suited for the dark, aristocratic villain he was beginning to imagine. The result of Stoker's work was the novel Dracula, published in 1897. With this book, the image of the vampire changed dramatically. Before Stoker's novel, vampires in European folklore were often described as grotesque and decaying corpses, bloated, unsettling figures that crawl from the grave to prey upon their former neighbors. Stoker transformed the image entirely. His vampire was no longer a mindless corpse, but an ancient and intelligent being. Count Dracula was depicted as aristocratic, cunning, and strangely charismatic. A nobleman who lived in a dark castle deep within the mountains of Transylvania, moving through shadows and feeding on the blood of the living in order to preserve his immortality. Through letters, journal entries, and eerie encounters described throughout the novel, Stoker crafted a figure that was both terrifying and strangely captivating. The success of the story ensured that this version of the vampire would become the one that most people recognize today. The elegant, mysterious predator, immortal, calculating, and eternally bound to the night, was born in the pages of Stoker's novel. From that moment onward, the vampire would no longer exist only in the scattered superstitions of villagers and graveyards. Instead, it had taken on a powerful new form in literature and imagination, one that would continue to evolve in books, theater, and eventually film, shaping the modern image of the vampire for generations to come. The influence of Dracula did not remain confined to literature for long. As the 20th century began, the story of the mysterious Count quickly found its way into the emerging world of cinema, where it would take a new form and interpretation. One of the earliest and most famous film adaptations appeared in 1922 with the German silent film Nosferatu, directed by F.W. Murnau. Although the filmmakers had not obtained the rights to Stoker's novel and were forced to change names and details, the character of Count Orlok was unmistakably inspired by Dracula. Unlike the aristocratic vampire described in the book, Orlok appeared as something far more monstrous. Bold, gaunt, with long claw-like fingers and rodent-like teeth. The eerie visuals and shadowy atmosphere of the film created one of the most haunting vampire portrayals in cinematic history and helped establish many of the dark, gothic elements that audiences would later associate with vampire stories. A decade later, the vampire returned to the screen in a form much closer to Stoker's original vision. In 1931, the American studio Universal released a film Dracula, starring the Hungarian actor Bela Lugosi. Lugosi's performance would become one of the most iconic portrayals of Dracula ever created. With his formal black cape, aristocratic manners, hypnotic stare, and distinctive accent, he introduced the image of the elegant vampire that would dominate popular culture for decades. Lugosi's Dracula was not merely a monster, but a sophisticated and mysterious figure, both terrifying and strangely captivating. His performance left such a strong impression that the visual image of the vampire in a cape, speaking slowly and moving with quiet confidence, became deeply embedded in the imagination of audiences around the world. In the decades that followed, the character of Dracula continued to evolve through new interpretations. During the late 50s and 60s, the British studio Hammer Films brought the vampire back to life in a darker and more dramatic style. Their adaptation, Dracula, starred the British actor Christopher Lee. Lee's portrayal was more intense and physically imposing than earlier versions. His Dracula was both seductive and terrifying, with blazing red eyes and a violent presence that emphasized the creature's predatory nature. These films introduced a stronger sense of horror and sensuality into vampire cinema, reflecting changing tastes in film audiences and further shaping the evolving image of the vampire. By the late 20th century, filmmakers began exploring the character in more psychological and romantic ways. One of the most visually striking interpretations appeared in the 1992 with Bram Stoker's Dracula, directed by Francis Ford Coppola. This adaptation attempted to return more closely to the atmosphere and structure of Stoker's original novel, while adding a tragic and emotional dimension to the character. In this version, Dracula was portrayed not only as a monster, but also as a cursed figure, driven by love and loss, a being trapped between humanity and immortality. Through each generation of film, the vampire continued to change shape, sometimes monstrous, sometimes seductive, sometimes tragic, but always rooted in the shadow first cast by the Bram Stoker novel. From silent German cinema to modern Gothic fantasy, the figure of Dracula has remained one of the most enduring characters in the history of storytelling, a creature whose presence continues to haunt both literature and the screen more than a century after his creation. Yet, perhaps the legend of the vampire has never truly disappeared. Across thousands of years of human history, cultures separated by vast oceans and continents have told remarkably similar stories. Stories of a shadow that moves through the darkness when the world falls silent. In ancient Mesopotamia, it appeared as a night demon stalking the vulnerable. In Greece, it took the form of cursed being that fed upon the blood of the living. In the villages of Eastern Europe, it was believed to rise from the grave itself, returning under the cover of night to prey upon those it once knew. In distant part of Asia and the Pacific, other forms of the same fear emerged, creatures that drain not only blood but the very life force of the victims. Though these legends took many shapes, demons, restless spirits, cursed humans, or monstrous creatures, they shared a common thread. Each described something that existed beyond the boundary between life and death. A being of the night, a silent predator that fed upon the vitality of the living. Over time, these fears evolved, changing with each culture and generation, until they eventually formed the figure we now recognize as the vampire. Yet, the persistence of these stories suggests something deeper within the human imagination. The vampire is more than a monster from folklore or fiction. It is a symbol that has followed humanity through centuries of myth, belief, and storytelling. Whether understood as demon, spirit, or myth, the vampire has always remained close to the edge of our collective imagination. It lingers in the ancient texts, whispered legends, and the shadows of the old stories. And perhaps that is why the figure continues to fascinate us even today, because somewhere in the darkness of human history, the idea of the vampire has always been there, silent and patient, watching and waiting just beyond the reach of the light. And perhaps somewhere in the darkness of history, the legend is not finished yet. And there we go. That is the story that we are going to read today. or I read today, congratulations to me, I thought that it was more than fitting to follow with the vampire story going from our demon lore. Obviously, we have seen that the demon lore started with women, Lamashtu, Lamia, and all of those. In the meantime, it did develop into something different. And as this storytelling goes, I think that it is fascinating how everything connects in the very subtle way. But anyhow, that is it for today. I hope you enjoyed this short story about Dracula. If you would like me to read perhaps parts of Bram Stoker's Dracula book, I think I could do that. It used to be one of my favorite books when I was younger. Nonetheless, it's still a very good piece of literature, and if you'd like me again to read it, just let me know. Okay, time to go now. Thank you so much, and I will see you next time. Bye.